afternoon and good evening to everyone. Welcome to this year's International Lasallian Days for Peace 2020, choosing to be catalysts of peace. I am Sofia Beltrano.
And I am Red Chu, and we will be your hosts for today. Today, we are celebrating International Lasallian Days for Peace with this very special virtual conference from the Office of the Vice President for Internal Affairs of the University Student Government under De La Salle University, Manila, in partnership with De La Salle, Philippines.
International Lasallian Days for Peace is an annual month-long celebration for Lasallians to unite as one whole community to promote peace and take action towards a humane and peaceful society. This year's theme is I Choose Peace, to encourage everyone to choose to make our world a better place and to choose peace as a response even to the simplest situation.
Well said, Sophia. And we actually have young Lasallians all around the world from the Philippines, Malaysia, Mexico, Indonesia, Austria, Colombia, Brazil, the UK, and the USA joining us today in this Zoom conference. Our delegates are aspiring to be catalysts who will be learning how to choose peace as a response to the re-emerging societal issues of gender violence, social inequality, and poverty. Later on, they will be the ones who will create their own responses to these three pillars. To explain further on the pillars, gender violence reflects on the idea that the violence will maintain the structural gender inequalities. This includes all genders such as violence against men, women, children, adolescents, the LGBTQ+ community, and gender non-conforming. Poverty response aims to show that a collective effort is vital in tackling societal problems. This pillar will revolve around ongoing initiatives and movements that are taking place all around the world. This aims to inspire and encourage the youth of the Lasallian community to make themselves more aware and come to realize that they may have a significant impact on solving societal issues such as poverty. Lastly, societal inequality, given that its relevance is at its peak in today's world, intends to provide knowledge regarding the structured and recurrent patterns of unequal distribution of goods and services, wealth, and opportunities within a specific society. Through this pillar, we will be able to set certain points of views to broaden the minds and consciousness of everyone in safeguarding our rights as humans.
That's right, Red. We are also privileged to have an international and local team of facilitators from De La Salle University, Manila, De La Salle College of St. Benilde, De La Salle, Philippines, International Council of Young Lasallians, Universidad La Salle, Mexico City, Universidad La Salle, Chihuahua, Mexico, La Salle University, Philadelphia, Uni La Salle, Rio de Janeiro, Universidad La Salle Noroeste, Mexico, and De La Salle Bajío, Mexico. But of course, we also have our viewers from our Facebook and YouTube live stream joining us today. So without further ado, welcome to the International Lasallian Days for Peace 2020, choosing to be catalysts of peace.
Well, what are we waiting for? Let us begin our conference with an opening message from the President of De La Salle University, Manila, Brother Raimundo Suplido, FSC.
Distinguished speakers and resource persons, beloved members of the academic community, friends who join us by means of this online program, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. A very warm welcome to all of you to this International Lasallian Day of Peace 2020. We all come together to reflect, to share ideas, activities, and plans, but above all, to choose concrete means to be catalysts of peace. To be a catalyst of peace is to be an agent of change, one who promotes transformation, transformation of oneself, transformation of society. And we do so in the footsteps of Jesus, the Prince of Peace. Pope Francis, in his message last January 1, 2020, reminded us, our humanity bears in its memory and its flesh the scars of ever more devastating wars and conflicts that affect especially the poor and vulnerable. We are called to bring healing to these scars and be catalysts in preventing new conflicts. And our Holy Father tells us Christ's gift of peace, the peace he calls his followers to make, requires action and initiative, because love by its nature is creative and seeks reconciliation at any cost. Members of our Lasallian family are striving to bring Christ's gift of peace in different parts of the world today. I want to share some examples with you. The Fratelli Project. Our Lasallian brothers and partners, together with the Marist brothers, have opened 2 centers to respond to the socio-educational needs of refugee children aged 3 to 15. These young people of Syrian and Iraqi nationality number about 600 in these 2 centers. They have fled their country to seek refuge in Lebanon. These centers were opened in 2016 and continue to the present time. In Sri Lanka, for dozens of years, the brothers in Sri Lanka taught in schools in spite of the civil war that was going on and which ended just a few years ago. However, during the time of conflict, Sinhalese and Tamil students were able to attend their schools and could pursue their education in spite of the conflicts. And in an effort for reconciliation, these schools worked together in order to promote peace. In 1973, in the Holy Land, Pope Paul VI requested the brothers to open a university that would reach out especially to Palestinian youth, those young people who wanted an education but could not have access to it because the universities were controlled by the Israeli government. This was how Bethlehem University was born. Since it opened, 17,300 alumni have graduated, and they have provided the needed skills and personnel to have the state of Palestine set up and continue to run. Here in De La Salle University, in February 12, 1995, we commemorated the 50th year of the tragic massacre of brothers and laypersons here on the DLSU campus. This was the closing days of World War II. In 1995, a Japanese LaSalle brother accompanied alumni of our school from Kagoshima, Japan, and they joined the Eucharist and the rites commemorating the massacre. At the end of the Mass, a representative of the Japanese group, none of whom were soldiers during World War II, by the way, he read a message of apology and sympathy on behalf of the Japanese people. another testimonial of being catalyst of peace and reconciliation. So, in different parts of our Lasallian world, we find Lasallians like yourselves taking actions and initiatives to be catalysts of peace. Follow the inspiration of the Spirit of Jesus. May this gathering also take creative steps to be instruments of change, to be messengers and catalysts of peace in our world today. Thank you. Have a very meaningful and fruitful day. Animo Lasal.
Brother Ray, for that wonderful opening message to start off our event. I'm sure our delegates and live stream viewers are very excited to hear from our speakers. So Sati, I feel like this would be the perfect time to start off with our first speaker.
Of course, Red, our first speaker will be focusing on gender violence. She is the program lead of the Women, Peace and Security portfolio of UN Women Philippines. She oversaw the field-level implementation of several peace and security projects, such as the Peace Building Fund, Gender-Sensitive Transitional Justice, Prevention of Violent Extremism, and Women in Law Enforcement projects in the conflict-affected areas of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. She works mostly with women leaders, civil society organizations, and government institutions to ensure that the UN Security Resolution 1325 is being implemented. She is also the former program officer of the Philippine Commission on Women and the former division chief of the Department of Social Welfare and Development. She obtained her master's degree in Asian Studies and specialized in Northeast Asian and ASEAN regional relations in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Let us all welcome our first speaker for today, Ms. Riza Torrado. Ms. Riza, please unmute po.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Sophia, for that very kind introduction. And allow me first to greet our participants from the Philippines. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. And I'd like to extend also my courtesies as well to our participants outside our time zone. Good afternoon or good evening, whichever is appropriate. So before I proceed into my presentation, I'd like to congratulate the De La Salle University, particularly the Student University Government, for organizing this two-day activity and have this platform for young people to discuss pressing issues of our time, such as gender-based violence, poverty, social inequality, the very themes that we have this morning. And more importantly, for recognizing the role of young people in addressing these issues. So may I proceed to my presentation? The topic given to me is about gender-based violence and how it connects with peace. So the first slide, please. In the course of my presentation, I'd like us to discuss about concepts about peace and security vis-a-vis gender-based violence, and see if there's a connection between these two seemingly different concepts and how they manifest actually in the developmental and emergency context. And along the presentation, I'd like us to go deeper and understand the root causes of gender-based violence and discuss the key issues surrounding this topic, why it is being enabled among women and girls in the Philippines. I must emphasize that my growing mostly from the context of the Philippines. We will be knowing about the legal frameworks and some of the international as well as the national instruments protecting women and girls against gender-based violence. And the last two objectives, I'd like here to wear my UN Women hat and to disseminate the key messages and, of course, share with you some practical tips. How can we correct these systems, these beliefs, cultures that enable these abuses to happen? And lastly, of course, to advocate against violence against women and gender-based violence and highlight that this is a threat to community safety and security and to the societal peace in general. Next slide, please. Okay, in the original conceptualization of this presentation, my initial idea was to present with you a video about an intimate partner violence that happened within this context of the pandemic, but I understand I'm given only 30 minutes, so there's a limitation to do an interactive discussion. So I'll just go straight into the realities or the statistics that we have about gender-based violence and violence against women. Maybe in the course of my presentation, I'll also highlight what's the difference between these two concepts and why I am using them interchangeably. So this is what the statistics, the data is saying to us, that 17% of Filipino women will experience physical, sexual, or intimate violence in their lifetime. This is the Philippines data. And the global data is more appalling because it says that 1 in every 3 will experience GBV in their lifetime. This is a data coming from our organization and the World Health Organization. And imagine that's 33% at least of the millions of women around the world. So another reality that we should recognize in the discussion of gender-based violence is this very relevant statistics. Note this one. It says at least 1 in 4 or 26% of married women will experience these typologies of violence from their partner and husband. And 20% will experience the same emotional violence. See, no, another one, and the most, I highlighted this in the presentation. It says here, the most common perpetrators are, okay, I'm seeing a chat here. I'm not being seen in the video, but yes, it says here, and this is very important to note, that the common perpetrators of this violence are people they are in close or even blood relationship with. So it debunks the myth that the perpetrators of gender-based violence are strangers, but are actually the very people very close to us. So next slide, please. Since I should move into the camera, closer to the camera. Oh, another very important reality, and I think we should be taking note of this one because it offers us insight on how we could actually address gender-based violence, because it presents a relationship about the vulnerability to violence as well as the levels of income, or if women has access to their own sources of livelihood and income. It says here that 21% of the women in lowest wealth quintile as against 12% in the highest wealth quintile, according again to the National Demographic and Health Survey data of 2017. And we should emphasize here that the reason behind why most women would stay in abusive relationships is the fact that they don't have their own sources of income, and they fear that if they will separate from the husband, who is usually the provider of the family, they will not have something to fend for themselves, and most especially for their children. So the resounding message of what this statistics is telling us if you young women will get married, better secure yourself that you have your own sources of income. Another very important is statistics that is here. It says, and let's note of this one: 2 in 1 or 46% of women from the Philippines will never, they will remain silent about it. And I think, as I discussed among the objectives of my presentation, what are these underlying structural causes of gender-based violence? One of these, we remain silent. We don't want to discuss about this because it brings dishonor usually to the family. In the Muslim Mindanao context where I worked for several years, I've seen this really manifest in both normal and in times of crisis, like times of displacement, like that. That they would rather keep things to themselves because it harms the honor of the family. And that perspective should change because it should not be the victim survivor who should feel ashamed, but who should be ashamed would be the one who perpetrated the crime. So another important statistics that we should highlight in this presentation, it says 1 in 4 women or 25 will tell someone of the experience, but they will not seek help. So this data is telling us that women or the victims, or most victims of GBV and VOW, would rather keep quiet and would not access justice. Why is that so? Again, some of the reasons that we have seen in the studies that were done along this line is again related to the economic opportunities that women possess. Why would they file a crime if they don't have jobs? They would rather use their money to feed their children rather than go to court. Next important point that we should highlight, the ones I said, the statistics that I said, these are all statistics in normal times. How about in times like the one we have now, in complex emergencies, like, for instance, war displacements, internal displacement due to calamities, and this pandemic, the health pandemic coronavirus that is raging all over the world? What is the relationship between this and the occurrence of gender-based violence? All studies point that in cases of like these ones, numbers or incidences of this gender-based violence rise worldwide. It is not confined to a particular country. It doesn't discriminate whether you are a poor or a rich country. It happens to the US, to the wealthier countries than us, the ones in the third world. So there could be various reasons explaining this one in the context of displacement, and I would like to relate it to the gender realities. In context of displacement, and we have seen this in the areas where we have conflicts in Mindanao, one of the reasons why gender-based violence occurs is that the sudden reversal of gender roles. Because in times of conflict, it's usually the man who stays in the house because of the threats to their security. They are usually the ones being recruited and being killed. So they'd rather stay in the family in context like that, and it's the woman who is mobile and is the one to be responsible for the needs of the family. And that sudden reversal, we see this one in Marawi, and that sudden reversal of gender roles. Now the men do not possess these sources of income. His idea of his masculinity, being the provider of the family, has changed, and this caused due unnecessary stress for the men because nawala yung pagkalalaki. Hindi na ako nagpro-provide para sa aking pamilya. So we also have consequences like due to this stress, we have issues around mental health during times like this. So it's also one of the prevailing reasons why we have rise of GBV in times of complex emergencies. Next slide, please. So how pervasive is this in the Philippines? This is the picture of how things are. According to reported cases, note again the difference between what I presented from the statistics of the NDHS and the PNP. That the statistics are reported cases are very low. Look at the latest data that they have provided last 2019. It's only around 21,366 out of a population of, I think we are then more than 100 million last year. So, and if you can see the trend, it's rising every year. So we have to note that this is both positive and negative in a way, because negative because it shows that as we progress along the way, cases of gender-based violence is still on the rise. And another way of looking at these rising statistics is that it could be a reflection that people or more of the victim survivors or the community are now aware that we have laws, that we have frameworks, and there are reporting mechanisms available in place. Hence, the rise in the reporting of cases. Okay, next slide, please. So, seeing those realities, that it is pervasive, it is universal, it cuts across culture, then we have to go into understanding what is this violence against women or gender-based violence. And I will read to you the definitions that we are using in the United Nations, coming from the UN Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, that it says it is an act of gender-based violence that results or is likely to result in sexual, psychological harm to women and or men, including threats of such acts, coercion, or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public and private life. Gender-based violence is any violence inflicted on women because of their sex. And take word of that note, because it's very rooted in the gender inequalities as conditioned by historical, structural, and cultural underpinnings, stating what should be the role of women, what should be the role of men, what are the expectations, the characteristics that comes along with their sexes. Next slide, please. This definition, I think we adopted it also in the Republic Act 9262, or the Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children. It's very similar that this is an act or series of acts that inflicts harm to a person. But the Philippine law is more definite in its categorization of who is who can file cases of violence against women, and these are it. And there are typologies such as physical, sexual, psychological, economic abuse. And let's go to them one by one, these typologies of violence. And I think at this point, I also, please proceed to the next slide. I'd like us to discuss a little bit of the distinction. Next slide, please. Yes. Maybe you are hearing me. Sorry. Yeah, maybe you are hearing me interchangeably referring to violence against women and gender-based violence. What is the difference between the two? Violence against women is violence directed against women, born women, ascribed to be women. And maybe this will take a lot of whole day of discussion. But whereas gender-based violence is any form of violence related to the gender identities and expression of a person. It's more as encompassing as compared to Mao, which is only referring to women, but gender-based violence is more inclusive. It recognizes the other gender identities and expressions beyond the binary of being men and women. It includes the LGBT and the other identities and expressions. So these are the typologies. Usually under the Philippine law, we have physical violence, or the acts that includes bodily or physical harm. And note of this very important studies showing again the gender nature of violence. It says here that among children, this is a UNICEF study conducted, I think 2017 or 2018. It says that violence is higher among male children than their female counterparts. And in a UNDP study, it says transgender children, particularly gay children and adolescents, suffer more physical abuse from their own families. So you see, it's when it comes to physical abuse and among children and young people, it's usually the male who are most vulnerable. And we ask why. It's because, again, it redounds to the root cause of gender inequality because we view the men as stronger. So maybe they can take a beating than their female counterparts. So next slide. And I think I'm, please remind me of my time if I'm consuming too much time because I'm only given 30 minutes here. Sexual violence. Some of these included sexual harassment, rape, acts of lasciviousness. Here, the ones listed here. And I'd like to highlight that incidents of sexual violence, specifically online sexual violence, has been on the rise since this pandemic has started. And the grim reality surrounding that is that some of the perpetrators of this act are, again, parents or the carers of these children. Next slide, please. We also have psychological abuse, or this refers to the acts or omission likely to cause mental or emotional suffering of the victim. They can be intimidation, harassment, stalking, damage to properties, public ridicule or humiliation, verbal abuses, even marital infidelity. Next one. We also have economic abuse, or this refers to the acts that make or attempt to make a woman financially dependent or withholding of entitlements of support. They could categorize as economic abuse, and even the use and enjoyment of conjugal or community property, which are owned common by the spouses. Next one, please. This might be a burning question among some of the participants because in some of the speaking engagements that I have conducted in the past, men actually are also complaining that they are also victims of violence from their spouses and partners. So the question is, do we have laws pertaining to this one? Can you complain? Can you use the VAUSI? The answer is, of course, not, because the VAUSI is for women and their children. But we have laws, other laws that you can refer to if you are a battered husband. But I'd like to highlight here again in this question the importance of gendered perspectives. Because yes, we do recognize that there are already anecdotes, incidences. We don't know the extent of this data of violence against men in intimate relationship. But the thing is, we don't have official reports. Why would not men go to report these incidences? Again, goes to the idea of gender inequality, that men should be the supreme or more supreme in a relationship. They are strong, so stuff like that. Next slide, please. Another question, if the perpetrator is a woman and the one who complains is another a transgender who ascribes to be man, can the VAUSI cover for that? Yes, because this is what the law says, that the law is explicitly saying that it refers to sex actually. It doesn't refer to the gender identity. So if you are born women, whether you in the process you ascribe yourself as a transgender, the law is still recognize that as a woman. So next slide. So we have instruments or international normative frameworks that has set the standards of how do we view gender-based violence. Amongst these, we have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We have the Beijing Platform for Action 1995, which also has a very specific provision on the elimination of VAW. We have these UN security resolutions, different numbers, but they speak about the recognition that gender-based violence in times of war are considered crimes against humanity and must be persecuted, and it is not acceptable. We all have what I just discussed, the violence anti-bawsi law in the Philippines. We have the anti-rape law. Recently, we have the Safe Spaces Act or the Bawal Bastos Act, which recognize incidences of gender-based violence happening online. So you might be entertaining the idea that why, in spite of all these available number of laws, we still have this incidences going higher each day. So what's wrong with the interventions that we are having and doing? And my simple answer is that because we have not been going into the root causes of the problem, which is actually rooted in our conception of gender inequalities and the unequal power relations between men and women. If we don't go to that, if we don't do interventions addressing the root causes, no matter hundreds of laws you will have, we will never address this issue of our time. So next slide, please. Oh, I think I have to mention in this presentation of laws, actually, a very important landmark case from the Philippines about myths and gendered conceptions surrounding rape. I don't know if some of you who are studying law or into legal studies have encountered this one, but the case of Karen Vertido, which is a rape case. Karen was an employee, and she accused her boss of raping her. So she filed the case, and the case was tried. But the court decided in favor of the accused. Uh, but so Karen filed the case to higher courts, but again, the higher courts concord with the decision of the lower courts. So Karen went to the UN and said that I didn't get justice from the Philippine government because I was not protected by the very laws. Because the reasons why the court decided in my case, let's look at them. One, because the accused rapist was already a senior citizen or an old man. One of the decisions of the court says that a man at that age couldn't probably have erection and cannot rape already. Another decision is that um, why didn't she fight? She could have fought the assailant and protect herself, but there was no indication of resistance. So the court says, so it could have been a consensual one. So you see, that landmark case is highly based on some myths surrounding rape. And that shows that even our justice system or the institution that should be the final arbiter of justice and equality is even surrounded with gender stereotypes. So these are the things that we should be seriously looking into it. That its institutions, the family, the school, the religious systems, the courts, we all have, they are not spared of this gender stereotypes and gender norms. They even perpetrated some of these. So just for the benefit of the young women who might be listening and if ever at risk of being possible victims of gender-based violence, I'd just like to highlight some of the important provisions of the law that you can actually request for temporary protection order from your barangays, temporary protection order, or even permanent protection order, and this will bar the perpetrators of the crime. Not from a certain diameter, they cannot get near you. So another important provision of the law, if in the event that you kill the husband or the partner who is assailing or battering you, the court recognizes the battered wife syndrome, and you could be acquitted if you use this one. And also, if the husband refrains to provide economic support to the children, you can also use this landmark law to request the employer to automatically deduct support. Okay, next one. So just to show where can we report in the Philippines. So these are some of the institutions where you can go to if you know of someone who are having problems related to this one. But let's put a caveat here that we have a case recently, I think a few months ago, of a young girl raped by two policemen. And then because she felt unsafe, she didn't go to report to the police where uh, the alleged rapists are working, rather to the other police station where she felt that she would be more safer. But on her way back home, she was killed. So in instances like that, that you feel that these institutions mandated to dispense protection is not protecting you, you could actually go to other institutions or organizations like civil society organizations, or maybe services within your academe, or the circles of trust. Go to people where you trust, where you feel safe. Next one, please. So I think I'm nearing the end of my presentation, and I'd like to discuss with you as young people what can we do to end violence against women and gender-based violence. So number one, speak up if you are a victim and if you witness this in your immediate community. Let's emphasize this point that violence against women and gender-based violence is a crime and not a private family matter. Maybe in the time of our grandparents, this is the dominant perspective. That's why people are keeping silent about it. That this is a personal issue, usapang mag-asawa, usapang pang-pamilya. But no, that perspective has to change. It is a crime, and it should be persecuted as a crime. Number two, we stop the culture of victim blaming and address the structural root causes of gender inequality. It's never the fault of the victim. It is not because of the way they dress or of the way they look that they are becoming victims of violence, but rather let's challenge the culture surrounding this one, including the the male machismo. Third, we promote positive masculinity. And I'd like to particularly point this out among our young people that it doesn't make you less of a man if you have only one partner or only one wife. It doesn't make you less of a man if you do household chores. It doesn't make you less of a man if you cry or if you show emotion. Okay, so, and number four, and I think it's very important, the community must never tolerate these kinds of incidences. Zero tolerance for the community. And next slide, please. I'd like to show you this example because, as I mentioned, these are some of the practical tips that we could do as young people in addressing this one. And I think part of the strategies that we have been really missing in addressing gender-based violence, even in the level of the UN, is involving the men actually to campaign against the elimination of this. So we have organizations like the Men Opposed to Violence Everywhere, which is an organization of male who are campaigning, networking, doing researches, speaking up against violence, gender-based violence and violence against women. So it is important to highlight the role of the men. For quite some time, we have always been focusing on the victims, on empowering women, turning a blind eye in a very important strategy, which is the role that men can do to advocate elimination of gender-based violence. Next slide. So I think this is my last slide, and I'd like to connect to the title of my presentation. Is there a relationship between peace and gender-based violence, violence against women? And my resounding answer to that is yes, because if we loosely define peace as something like the absence of war or the absence of conflict, absence of violence from a particular person or a particular group, then peace cannot exist if in the system we also have vow. So to me, vow is a threat to personal and community security. If we allow this violence to happen to our mothers, to our daughters, sisters, friends, then imagine what kind of community do we have. And for closing my presentation, I'd like to state this one, that we will not achieve peace if we allow or tolerate violence within the spaces, particularly the family, and to the people that we should be caring for and protecting from in the first place. Allow this violence to happen within the social sphere. What is our guarantee that it will not spill into the larger social spaces like schools, religious systems, and even to the larger society? So that, young people, is my presentation, and I'd like to call you to become agents or help us in eliminating violence against women and gender-based violence and all kinds of violence, because it is a threat to our safety and to our peaceful way of living. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Despite having all the laws that we have against violence against women or gender-based violence, these won't be effective if we don't address the root cause, which is gender inequality. So thank you so much, Ms. Riza, for that very insightful speech. Am I right, Rhett?
That is absolutely right. I really like what you said, Miss Riza. And I like how you also cited examples of these violences that we witness today. So it really brings into the world the relevance of this problem. So thank you very much, Ms. Riza. And we'll see you again later for the panel discussion portion. Moving on to our next speaker for social inequality. She currently serves as the Associate Executive Director for the Office for Mission and Ministry of the District of Eastern North America, which focuses on Lasallian spirituality, evangelization, justice education, and advocacy initiatives. She is also the co-founder of Lasallian Women of Hope, a project of solidarity and development on LUS. She has been a presenter at the Budemeyer Institute, the Brother John Johnson Institute for Contemporary Lasallian Studies, and the annual Roland Heure Conference. She participated in the Roland and International New Zealand Women's Symposiums. Marianne was a delegate to the Second International Assembly and is a delegate from Roland to the upcoming annual gathering to be held in Rome in 2021. She holds a MA in Theology from St. John's University, New York. Without further ado, let us all welcome Marianne Donahue Lynch.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here with you. I appreciate the invitation. Thank you to Mr. Cruz, the Vice President for Internal Affairs, and the entire coordinating committee from De La Salle University, to Mr. Keen Palatino, the coordinator for Young Lasallians, for the invitation to be with you, to our wonderful hosts, and welcome Lasallians from all over the world. This is very exciting. I would like to begin my presentation this evening with stating the obvious. I am a white, middle-aged woman. Additionally, I live in a diverse, middle-class neighborhood in the Northeast section of the United States. I am Catholic, married, a parent, and a grandmother. And I share this with you because when we discuss inequality, it's very important for us to know what place we are standing in at the moment that we enter into these conversations. I share this because I'm on a lifelong journey of self-discovery just like you. So what I am today is not what I will be tomorrow. I have a personal commitment to continue to educate myself, to be uncomfortable, to place myself outside of my encampments. And as a woman who has experienced gender discrimination and at times inequality, I know the value of allies. I appreciate and do not take for granted when men and other women recognize and address the injustices that women can experience in my society. And as we just heard from the wonderful speaker, women globally, the challenges of equality. But for our purposes now, my primary identity is that of being Lasallian and being with you. And as Lasallians, we welcome all people of goodwill to the mission. Pope Francis uses the image of a big tent. And so let's all gather together as a Lasallian community under the big tent. I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of reflective writing during this presentation, just a little bit. So please have something nearby so you can do that. Thank you. Next slide, please. This image is of a memorial for John Lennon located in Strawberry Fields in New York City's Central Park. In my conversation with the planning committee for this event, both the theme for this gathering, choosing to be catalysts of peace, and the reference to John Lennon's song, Imagine, drew me in. Imagine all the people living lives in peace. What would that take? What would it take for all of the people to live lives in peace? A peace that begins and ends with justice.
La paz que termina con una paz que
solves. It says the language interpretation. That take, a peace that identifies and solves the social inequities of the world. We do have to begin with imagining, because our current
Tenemos que comenzar imaginando.
so deep, we do have to imagine to dream.
Tenemos que imaginar que soñamos.
Is this
La otra
image
imagen que quería
of the
compartir
Trinity.
con ustedes.
In 15th century Russia, the Holy Trinity was the embodiment
En el siglo
of
XV en Rusia,
wall behind the altar. The Trinity is an important icon for Lasallians, as the brothers' vow of consecration begins with this prayer. Most Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, with profound respect before your infinite majesty, I consecrate myself entirely to procure your glory as far as I am able and as you will require of me. But why this rendition of the Trinity? Why this image? What I would like to call our attention to is that this icon represents encounter and hospitality, two hallmarks of being Lasallians, encounter and hospitality. It takes as its subject the mysterious story where Abraham from the Old Testament receives three visitors as he camps by the oak tree. He serves them a meal. And as the conversation progresses, Abraham seems to be talking straight to God, as the three angels are a metaphor for the three persons of Trinity. Look at the icon closely. The composition here is of a great circle around a table, and we are invited into that circle to pull up a chair and enter into the conversation, to be part of the movements of God in the world by our own response, to imagine with God. The Creator God is the great imaginer. Before we were formed in the Creator's image and likeness, we were present in the Creator's imagination. Today, as Lasallians, we are called to be co-imaginators with God, to build God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Servant of God Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, in 1933, during the Great Depression here in the United States, said, quote, "The greatest challenge of the day is how to bring a revolution of the heart, a revolution which has to start with each one of us." And almost a century later, my brothers and sisters, we are still in need of a revolution of the heart. So as I go through this presentation, know that the transformation that we are seeking from inequality to justice is fundamentally a work of the heart, a heart that is open to encounters, hospitality, dialogue, grace, prophetic action, and yes, imagination. And I see that our Spanish translation is just back. So I'm just going to simply summarize this icon and say that as Lasallians, as people of goodwill, of faith, we are called to enter into this icon with the Trinity, pull up a chair and enter into the imagination and the creativity of the Trinity. Next slide, please. So in September of 2010, a decade ago, the Brothers of the Christian Schools issued Circular 461. Now, a circular holds a degree of importance, second only to the documents created by a general chapter. So this circular, associated for the Lasallian mission and active hope, focused on association. What does it mean to be together and by association for the mission? As Lasallians, our primary reason for association is the mission, to give a human and Christian education to the young, especially the poor. No matter where you go in the 80 countries that we Lasallians share our ministry in, or what ministry you are visiting throughout the Institute, the mission remains the same. How we engage in the mission takes on all the cultural, societal, and religious hues and textures of our diverse Lasallian family, but the mission is the same. So for our purposes today, this particular insight from the circular is essential to how we understand being Lasallian, how we understand how we are to be with one another, how we are to see one another on the personal, interpersonal, and institutional levels. So at this point, I would invite you to read the quote from Circular 461 and just take a minute to jot down what captures your best attention. Slide, please. This particular image has become very popular around social media in terms of looking at the issues of equality, equity, and soon liberation or justice. So again, I would invite you to look at this particular image and just jot down a few words. What captures your attention in this image? What do you think this image is saying as related to equality and equity? Next slide, please. So I would invite you to do the same here. Here we have an image of liberation. The fence is gone. So again, just some of your thoughts regarding this particular image of equality, equity, and liberation. And now I would invite you to think, is there anything about this image that you find perhaps a little unsettling, a little out of kilter in terms of what they are trying to explain with this image in terms of equality, equity, and liberation? Next slide, please. So let me give you some of my thoughts on this, but I want you to know that my primary source comes from a post on the website culturalorganizing.org. Give them credit too. In the first two images, all three people have one crate to stand on. In other words, there is equality because everyone has the same number of crates. And while this is helpful for the middle height person, it's not enough for the shortest, and it is not needed for the tallest. In contrast, in the second image, there is equality. Equity. Each person has the number of crates they need to fully enjoy viewing the game. The distinction between equity and equality is an important one. For example, if we're talking about something such as school funding, advocating for equality would mean ensuring that all schools have the same amount of resources per pupil. On the other hand, advocating for equity would mean recognizing that some schools, like in my country, for example, those serving students in low-income areas would actually need more resources, funding, more experienced teachers, more relevant curriculum, if we're going to make a dent in the educational disparities that have come to be known as the achievement gap. But the problem with this particular graphic has to do with where the initial inequity is located. In the graphic, some of the people need more support to see over the fence because they are shorter, an issue inherent to people themselves. Inherent to people themselves. So that's fine if we're talking about height, but this is supposed to be a metaphor for other inequities, race, gender, sexual orientation. And that's where it becomes problematic. For instance, if we return to the school funding example, the image implies that students in low-income, let's say, communities of color and other marginalized communities need more resources in their schools because they are inherently less academically capable. They or their families or their communities are metaphorically shorter and need more support. But that is not why the so-called achievement gap exists. As many have argued, it should actually be termed the opportunity gap, because the problem is not in the ability of the students, but in the disparate opportunities that they are afforded. And it is rooted in a history of oppression, from colonialization to slavery to separate but equal. It is sustained by systemic racism. And in my country and in other countries as well, an ever-growing economic inequality. So this metaphor is actually a great image for, or a great example for, deficit thinking, which is an ideology that blames people who are oppressed for their own oppression or for their own situation. As with this image, deficit thinking makes systems that form racism and oppression invisible. It makes the systems look invisible. So I'd like you to consider for a moment, what would be an example of deficit thinking in your context? Just write that down, 30 seconds. What would be an example of deficit thinking in your context? An ideology that blames people who are oppressed for their own oppression or situation. Next slide, please. Let me share an example. In 1986, at the height of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, Archbishop Nobel Peace Prize winner Desmond Tutu was installed as Cape Town's first Black Anglican Archbishop, thus becoming the head of the Anglican Church in South Africa with 1.6 million members. However, Archbishop Tutu could not live in the house that his predecessors had lived in as head of the Anglican Church because it was located in a white-only neighborhood in Cape Town. During apartheid, Archbishop Tutu was well known internationally as an outspoken critic of the racist apartheid policies of his country, the separation of people based on race, and was often under death threats from various groups, but nevertheless continued with his prophetic actions. On a visit to the United States at the height of the global anti-apartheid movement, he spoke at a small church here in Newport, Rhode Island. I happened to be in the audience that evening. You could feel the electricity in the air as he walked up into the lectern to preach after the gospel had been read. Now, an interesting point is that there was a restriction on his visa to the United States. And the restriction was he could not say anything political. He could not talk about the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. He could not talk about the apartheid system of the separation of races in South Africa. He was given the visa as a priest, as a cleric, and he could preach, but say nothing political, or else they put him on a plane and send him back to South Africa. So we went up into the pulpit, and he looked out into those gathered in the church, and he cupped his hands under his face, and he said, "Made in the image and likeness of God." Made in the image and likeness of God. Now, my brothers and sisters, that is a fundamental religious theological statement. We are all made in the image and likeness of God. But was it also a political statement? What do you think? Was it also a political statement? Because if we recognize that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, then what are the structures of injustice that we need to look at? And if we're all to be treated as the children of God, then what is our society to look like? Can we imagine a society where people live lives in peace and they're able to live where they want to live, regardless of the color of their skin? Next slide, please. So I'm going to share with you the next 4 slides that are a little bit better images at getting at some of our conversation around equality, equity, liberation, and justice. So inequality here, unequal access to opportunities, right? That's sort of self-explanatory. Unequal access to resource. Think for a moment, what are some inequalities that exist in your society, in your communities? Where do people not have access to opportunity? Next slide, please. Equality, evenly distributed tools and assistance. So everybody gets a ladder, right? Everyone gets a ladder, but there's still a problem here with equality. Even though the goods, the tools, and the assistance are being equally distributed. So thinking back to our our example in terms of education. So everybody receives the same books, access to food, transportation, funding, all equal. Next slide, please. Equity. We start to see the difference here. Custom tools that identify and address inequality. So somebody needs a taller ladder to be able to reach the apples on the tree, right? So here we have equity. Equity recognizes the structural injustices that need to be addressed. So for example, more funding in rural areas, environmental issues that impact education, food insecurities, hungry children can't learn. So are we looking at custom tools that identify and address inequity? Next slide, please. And here we have justice, fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. How schools are funded. Do people have access to technology? But still, this slide, these images still don't quite touch upon the depth of what we need to consider. So while they fix the tree, we need to back up a little bit in our conversation. Looking at this, what kinds of questions does this justice slide raise for you? For example, who chose to plant a tree in the first place? Why is it planted in this location? Who was responsible for watching and monitoring the growth of the tree so it didn't grow in the direction that caused it to be unequal in the first place? What did it take to fix the tree? Protests, writing letters to government officials, changing of laws? Was there a restructuring of wealth required to fund the straightening of the tree? Where was the decision initially made to plant this tree? Who sat at that table? Who created the table? Who imagined the table? I hope you see where I'm going with this analogy. Think about it within your own context. How you create systems for justice requires us to go to the very basics of who is involved and who is engaged. And fundamentally, the people that are most affected by the injustice should be the primary ones involved and engaged and empowered. Next slide, please. So you're probably familiar with this particular image. It appears in various ways around our Lasallian family and throughout our church. The 2 feet of love and action, or the 2 feet of Catholic social teaching. And so we see we have the charitable works. You know, if somebody's hungry, they need to be fed. If someone's homeless, we need to provide shelter. But then the social justice, the advocacy, getting to the root causes. Why are people hungry? Why are people homeless? Dom Helder Camara, a former Archbishop of Brazil, had a very famous quote. He said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." Recently, the Institute of the Brothers of the Christian Schools, our Lasallian family, published a document, Declaration on the Lasallian Educational Mission. And in it we read, listen to this, Lasallians, we read, "Lasallian education has an inalienable social dimension because it has its roots in the gospel and the promotion of human dignity, solidarity with human beings, and sustainable development. And when opting for humanization and social justice as inspiration, the educational result is essential. Neutrality is not possible. Neutrality is not possible." I'm still quoting from the document. "The educational service of the poor is inseparable from the promotion of peace." the educational service of the poor, my brothers and sisters, is inseparable from the promotion of justice and of peace. So consider for a moment, as you look at this particular graphic, consider for a moment, is there something that you're involved in terms of service as a young Lasallian? Is there some charitable outreach that you're engaged in that you could look more deeply at the structural issues that require justice? I'll just pause for 20 seconds for you to consider that and perhaps jot that down. What would be an example in your context? Thank you. Now, before I move on, as students, as a teacher and as students, I want you to look at that lower left-hand corner, because Jesus gives us the answers to the final exam. In Matthew 25, remember the question is asked, what do I need to do to enter the kingdom of heaven? And it's very unusual because when Jesus is asked with a question, he usually responds with a question, right? Or offers a story, a parable. But here in Matthew 25, it's pretty direct what we need to do in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. So I'll leave that with you to look up Matthew 25 and have some conversation around it. So what I'd like to present now are 3 areas in which inequality has reached pandemic levels. Obviously, COVID-19, the lack of and racism. So let's look at COVID-19. This global pandemic has upended our global society. It has brought out the best and the worst in humanity. It has exposed the underbelly of our societies and has shown the vast inequalities that exist in our local societies and in our global family. It has highlighted as well the vital interconnectedness between all of us. So I would like to share with you 10 equity implications of COVID-19, the pandemic, from my country, out of my lived reality. First, unfortunately, with this particular pandemic, there has been an increase in racist attitudes and attacks towards Asians in my country. Second, that made clear the differential exposure of this virus to the elderly, Black, Indigenous, people of color, low income, homeless, prisoners. 3, the plight of the frontline workers and the teachers and the burdens that they have to carry during this pandemic. 4th, it has raised our awareness of the inequities that exist with environmental issues, including the use of toxic cleaning materials in poorer communities. 5th, it has raised issues around education, lack of access to technology. So when our schools closed and we had to pivot to online learning, it became clear that not all of our students clearly had access to the resources that they needed in order to continue their education. So I know for our Lasallian schools, there are great efforts to attend to that inequality. But the other things that became lacking was the food safety net that happens in our schools and the mental health support that happens in our schools as well. 6, for many of our communities, there was simply a lack to COVID testing. And so it was impossible to begin to look at and understand how to control the pandemic because the testing simply wasn't available in poorer communities. 7, there were times where the quarantine policies that were enacted in some of our communities was used as tools of discrimination. And that needed to be looked at and attended to. 8, sometimes COVID-19 was used as an excuse to restrict immigration and migration patterns. 9, There was a denial and a misinformation regarding the virus in this country that led to incredible confusion. And frankly, it continues to this day. And 10, the virus had an impact on our vehicles for democracy. You may have heard we're having a presidential election in this country in a few weeks, and our vehicles of democracy were interrupted or paused. Our census taking abilities, the campaigning, and now we're dealing with situations that are restricting access to voting. So in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see that it has brought about and brought into focus many of the inequities that exist in my country. And again, I'd like to just pause for a moment and just have you jot down, what has been your reality? What are some of the inequities that have surfaced in your communities due to COVID-19? Thank you. Next slide, please. The other area I would like to touch upon is education. As Lasallians, this is our mission, right? A quote from a global activist for education that we all know, Malalia. And she said, quote, "Education is a basic right, not just in the West. Islam too has given this right. Around the world, there are 57 million children who are not in primary school, and 32 million of them are girls." And again, relating back to the COVID pandemic, we know that in communities around this globe, there's a generation that has lost a year plus of access to education. So how have we as Lasallians responded to these inequities? And I would just like to highlight some of the ways that we have imagined, that we have entered creatively into responding to the need for equity in education. So in Haiti, after the devastating earthquake in 2012, Lasallians built a new school in Port-au-Prince and joined with the Blue Nuns from Argentina to construct a women and children's health and nutrition center on the grounds of the educational compound. In South Sudan, to address dire poverty and political violence in South Sudan, a new school in Rumbek was established. We heard Brother earlier in this program, as part of his introduction, talk about the Fratelli Project in Lebanon that was established to provide security and education to the children fleeing the war in Syria. And this was done in conjunction with the Marist brothers. In our Lasallian family, 57% of Lasallians engaged in the mission are women. And we know that girls and women face particular structural injustices when accessing education. So Lasallian Women of Hope is a project of the Secretariat of Solidarity and Development in Rome. And currently there are grassroots projects in Kenya, Papua New Guinea, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and South Africa to address some of these inequities. In the Philippines, Lasallians have engaged in education for justice and actions on behalf of human rights that serves as a model for our Lasallian family of how we are called to prophetic action in living the mission and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Globally, addressing inequities brought to light because of COVID, Lasallians have responded creatively all over the globe. And currently, the Secretariat of Solidarity and Development has an educational campaign regarding the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goal 4, access to equitable education. And you can find information about that at lasalle.org. So in this particular area of education, I just wanted to highlight the hope, the vision, the creativity, the response that we as Lasallians have done and can continue to dream and imagine to do as we look at the challenges that face us in this area. Next slide, please.
Es que no fluye, no fluye nada.
The issue of racism. And again, there's many graphics, many ways in which we can approach this. But for our conversation this evening, these particular 4 areas. And again, I'd like to give credit to a website, Slow Factory Foundation, if you're looking for resources.org. So we have these 4 dimensions of racism. Interpersonal. It occurs between individuals. That the bias that occurs when individuals interact with one another and their personal racial beliefs affect their public interactions. So racist act, microaggressions carried out on Black, Indigenous people of color. Internalized. Internalized racism lies within individuals. This type of racism comprises our private beliefs and biases about race and racism, influenced by our culture. This can take many different forms, including prejudice towards others of a different race, internalizing oppression, the negative beliefs about oneself by people of color, or internalized privilege beliefs about superiority or entitlement by white people. Hence my introduction that I began with. And then we look at institutional. This refers to unfair policies and discriminatory practices of particular institutions like schools or workplaces that routinely produce racial inequitable outcomes for people of color and advantages for white people. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution when they reinforce racial inequities. And then structural. Here, racial bias among institutions and across society. This involves the cumulative and compounding effects of an array of societal factors, including the history, culture, ideology, interactions of institutions, and policies that systematically privilege certain races of people and disadvantage others. So in my country, an example of that would be the call for police reform. So think for a minute, how do these definitions compare with your personal understanding of racism? Many of you are probably familiar with the death of Mr. George Floyd on May 25th of this year. Mr. Floyd was in the process of being arrested for suspicion of committing a nonviolent crime and was held to the ground under the knee of a police officer and died from asphyxiation. My country erupted in protest and in some cases riots. After the death of George Floyd, the District of Eastern North America, my district, one response was to form a racial justice coalition, but Lasallians all over the world responded to this death and continue to look at issues of racism in our society. I had a conversation with students in the District of Eastern North America. Some students from our secondary schools and our colleges and universities, asking them to reflect upon what they saw as things that need to be changed or considered in terms of our own institutional structures. And I would like to share with you the thoughts of your fellow young Lasallians regarding this issue. So in no particular order, they talked about the need to look at curriculum, across curriculum. What are we using? What are the texts? What are the movies? What are the videos? What are we using as resources? And are the resources we using reflective of the diversity of our community? Not just along race, but the diversity of topics, diversity of the people that make up our educational learning communities. Next, they talked about hiring for diversity. What are the practices that exist in your institutions, in your schools, both in terms of full-time faculty, but also in terms of people who are engaged in co-curricular activities or coaches for sports. They talked about speakers that are invited into the schools. Who are you inviting? Is there a diversity of people that are being invited? Who are the alumni and alumnae that you are inviting back as role models of people who graduated from your institutions that you're holding up as, again, as a role model as to what it means to be a Lasallian as a graduate from your school? What about your prayers, the way that you gather to worship? Is there respect for the interfaith dimensions, the ecumenical dimensions of your community, the various cultural expressions of faith that exists within your schools? Who serves on your board of directors or advisory groups? Who's at the table? Is there diversity there? They brought up the visual dimension, the physical, artistic representation of our beliefs in our school culture. What hangs on our walls? What kind of artwork is there? Who do we see? Are the students in the schools, the faculty and the staff, are they reflected in what we place on our walls? Social media presence. How do we, as Lasallians, use and express our Lasallian values and the Lasallian mission through social media? How is that reflective of the diversity of your community? The students in the secondary schools brought up the concern they have sometimes with the student handbook. Interestingly enough, and again, this is in my context here in the District of Eastern North America, in the area of grooming practices. So in the student handbook, what are we looking at in terms of even just, how people are able to style their hair? And then the reporting practices. Is it transparent? Next slide, please. So I am coming up on my time. So I am just going to offer this particular quote from Pope Francis. And he talks about having 3 acts of courage. And one is to put people at the center of what we do. The second is to have a new compact, particularly on education, that strengthens community. And then the third is to have individuals that serve our community. Next slide, please. Just some takeaways from Fratelli Tutti, and because of time, I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'd like to end with this reflection from Martin Luther King Jr. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will be only an initial act. One day, we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard or superficial. It comes to that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And next slide, please. So our Superior General, Brother Robert Schuller, in a recent video said, "You are part of the miracle. How do you live that miracle? We live it when we live our lives with passion, when we remember that we are in the presence of God, when we join hands in support of one another, when we are in solidarity with one another, when we respect the dignity of all people, reach out to help the vulnerable and those who are suffering." He concluded with these words, "So wake up, move your feet. We have great confidence in you." Thank you so much for the privilege of being with you today for this presentation. God bless.
Thank you so much, Miss Mary Ann Donahue Lynch, for that very inspiring talk on social inequality.
So moving forward, our last speaker for the poverty pillar is an accomplished social justice advocate with more than 10 years of interdisciplinary experience in gender, public health, and innovation. She works at the nexus of humanitarian action and development to tackle issues of equity, inclusion, and accountability in service of diverse and affected communities. She is also currently leading the strategic engagement of digital platforms to enhance a people-centered approach to humanitarian action and supporting the vision to scale the use of tech innovation. For the COVID-19 response, she led an agile cross-divisional global working group, which includes being part of the team to develop UNICEF's COVID-19 chatbot, which was deployed and localized in 52 countries in 16 languages. A thought leader, published author, and community mobilizer. Let us all welcome Ms. Fatou Wouri.
Thank you so much. That was such a generous introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry my voice sounds so hoarse. It's 3:35 a.m. here in Geneva, but I definitely, yeah, I'm up super early, but I had committed and I wanted to show up. I think anytime there's a congregation and there's a gathering of young people, excited people, really all of you here today are our current future, are our present. I don't believe necessarily in the future. You are the actors, the movers, the shapers, and so I couldn't say no. To the Lasallians, non-Lasallians, anyone and everyone listening today, thank you for holding space to really deep dive. To the president of the university, to the panelists that came beforehand. It was granted, I was lying in bed, but I do want to thank you for the wonderful conversation. I love that we began this with such an eloquent overview from our host, Sophia and Rhett, if I pronounce the names correctly. And I really appreciated that we started with gender-based violence. And we know that, violence disproportionately affects women and girls. So to me, it felt like you were putting that agenda at the heart of this peace conversation, which I think is important. And of course, gender is boys, girls, non-binary people, acknowledging that whatever your identity is, everyone should live in a society and a community and a home and a school that is free from discrimination. So I really appreciated that overview. And then to go to the second panelist, we're in, such an amazing breakdown of social justice, what that means in the context of spirituality, how it all comes back down to our hearts. I love the use of the heart space because it really is about identifying what our value system is and why it matters that we think about equality and equity. So I'm going to have a conversation. I don't have fancy slides, people, at all to show, mostly because I'm on the move and it's been a bit of a hectic last couple of days. So my apologies, but I wanted to have a conversation. I don't think it's going to be a very long one. Didn't realize that 3 a.m. will hit me so hard. But what I wanted to do was just have a heart-to-heart conversation about my experiences and how that's led me to where I am right now, looking at global policy, working for one of the largest multilateral organizations dedicated to children, what it means to work in a rights-based organization that's committed to serving children all around the world, 190 countries, and ensuring that we put people's voices, minds, needs at the center of everything that we do. That's not to say we do it perfectly, but we try to reach scale. And so what does that mean for a Black woman coming from a small country in West Africa called Sierra Leone, from such humble beginnings to be sitting in a global space? And what has driven me to come here? It's the gender angle, it's the heart space angle, it is the realization that my value system to see a more equitable world really is what's driven and shaped my career. And so it's a bit of, that journey, and then we'll get into sort of the issues around what it means to live in a COVID world, wherein the international commitment to peace has never been more greater. So one of the things I'd love to do, I don't know if I can see everyone, the 240 people that are on, if I can see you on the chat, but my topic is around peace, which, by the way, means everything and has a multiplicity of ways in which you can interpret that. But in this context, I would love to hear from all of you, excuse me, I would love to hear from all of you what your definition of peace is. Just the first thing that comes to mind when someone says peace, what does that look like for you? And it's personal, it's spiritual, it's political, it's all of the above. So please do put it in the chat. If I can see it, I would love to see it, or if the moderators can put it so that I can see it as I'm going. Locking arms. I don't know if that's one word, but just put it in. I love it. So we're going to talk about peace and what that means. I think one of the prompts that I was given by the organizers, by the way, congratulations for organizing this. I love student-led organization. You guys are so bomb. Is just to say that for me, if anyone loves Prince, loves music, Prince has this one song called Baltimore. And in there, he says that peace is not the absence of war. Like I said when I started this conversation, I am from Sierra Leone. If any of you think about Sierra Leone, what's the first thing that comes to mind? This tiny little country in West Africa. We've gone through 11 years of civil war. Not only has my country gone through 11 years of civil war, we've also suffered the consequences of emerging out of civil war, forcing us to reevaluate and redefine what it means to exist in a new and form a new social contract. So I come from that space. And then after my country suffered one of the largest cholera outbreaks. And then after that, most recently, I'm sure many of you know, we've also endured the Ebola outbreak. And so for the longest time, when we came from a post-war country, the thing was, well, now we have peace, right? It's peace and reconciliation, peace and justice, peace and all these, everything is going to be equal because you don't have violence and the fear of death at your door in every step. You are now an okay nation. But we emerged fragile economically, socially, politically, and we've never really attained peace because at the end of the day, based on all your definitions of peace, unity, love, justice, togetherness, freedom, tranquility, equity, a unified world. These are beautiful concepts that are incredibly difficult to attain. They require intentionality. They require rebuilding the social construct that has been degraded by violence. And we've come to learn that, and we've had to redefine what peace would look like for us. So coming from that place and living all around the world, including spending some time in the Philippines, actually, living in Manila, Ayala, I've lived in about, close to 20 countries. And in that movement and in that journey of navigating the world, being very much rooted in my local roots as an African woman, African and woman, and then being able to live in different parts of the world, I quickly realized that gender, my very embodiment as a woman, meant I was disproportionately affected by conflict, by fragility, by the very embodiment that I'm a Black person as well. And so it didn't matter if I lived in South Asia, Southeast Asia, North America, Latin America, lived even in certain parts of Africa, lived in Europe, lived in the United States. I quickly understood that despite the difference that I was personally experiencing discrimination for, it is the very same discrimination and the very same needs and the very same desires that I have for safety, for security, to be seen, to be heard, to be honored. These are universal themes. And so even though at a very young age, I was thrust and raised by a global community with all its complexities, in my home, I understood what safety meant. The fact that I was privileged, I could access education safely. The fact that I can go to school, the fact that I can eat 3 meals a day. I also understood what safety meant. And that is a feeling I wanted every young girl and boy, especially people from disadvantaged communities, marginalized communities, indigenous people, Black people, brown bodies, non-binary people. The safety I felt in my home is what I know every single person deserves. And that has led me and built my value system that I think the previous speaker spoke about, from the heart space to play my part in ensuring that more people, we lived in a more equitable world. So in that space, when I left Sierra Leone when I was 3 years old, I returned back to my home country to serve 21 years later. And in that, I was part of the Ebola response, as well as the cholera response, as well as really being a huge advocate for gender equality, ensuring that women and girls had access to quality healthcare, and that they were surviving during childbirth, and that their sexual and reproductive health and rights were a priority of governments, of communities, of policymakers, and of multilateral organizations. It was very important that people recognize that Sierra Leonean women, African women, and I think any person that's a person of color in particular, or a woman, is not seen as a passive thing that needs to be saved, but that we are active agents that can be that need pathways, equitable pathways to actualize our fullness. And so that journey is what's led me to what I do right now with UNICEF. What I want to tap into now is, after working in my country and being able to say I've worked at country level, I want to take these concepts at global level and be part of shaping how we think about peace. I want to get into the conversations of how this affects my work right now and what that has actively meant in the COVID response. When I started, I said the international commitment to peace has never been greater. We know this. All around the world, without even this conversation, you put on the news, Black Lives Matter, people are coming out, the Me Too movement, Time's Up, revolutions and social movements all around the world, inspired by young people like you, demanding better, having the audacity to say, I want togetherness, I want a unified world, I want security, I want acknowledgement, I want access. You're doing it better, you're doing it even bolder, you're doing it wiser, and you're using and utilizing as many tools as possible to have your voices heard. And I know that even within that, there are many young people and children who do not have access to having their voices heard. So when we think about the sustainable within the framework we work in, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the SDGs, adopted by the United Nations in September of 2015, recognizes that peace and security are prerequisites for achieving sustainable development. But that sustainable development provides the pathway for peaceful societies. If we don't have our countries that have basic functioning institutions where people know they can walk out and be alive, or can access social institutions and services, can go to school, can go to the court, can shop, can be safe, then it's anything but safe. So the fact that the international community really wanted to focus the SDGs on a peace-centered agenda, the African Union, for those of you who know, have also have a peace agenda called Silent the Guns, saying that across the continent of Africa, we're going to silence the guns, so that we're thinking about less war, less fragility, more amplification of youth voices, centering the voices and the needs and the agendas of women and girls, of those living with disability, of non-binary people. So as you can see globally, there's this peace agenda, because there's a recognition that if the very fabric of our societies are unpeaceful, everything that we do is pretty much ad hoc and will not lead to sustainability, or will really hinder the gains we've made. So this new peace-centered agenda is meant to be inclusive, and it's ambitious, and it's meant to foster a spirit of global solidarity, which we know COVID has severely threatened. This peace agenda has 5 main pillars of peace: defining what peace means, which is security, thinking about people, thinking about the planet, the environment, climate change, ensuring that water and sanitation is accessible to everybody, prosperity, economic prosperity, political prosperity, seeing strengthened governance, and partnerships. And partnerships is where, and that is meant to have opened this new era of how we think about development. Translating all of those 5 pillars that I just spoke about, peace, people, planet, prosperity, and partnership, into 17 goals and that have 169 targets. And that is meant to orient the globe, all of us, right, into concrete action to ensure that we can support and engage our communities. And this can only be done with major stakeholders like government, civil society, businesses, parliamentarians, international organizations, and most importantly, you right now. You matter in all of this. The COVID response, this global pandemic, this global threat, which is very much parallel to my own sort of experiences, recognizing that in my own small identity, there are global linkages and global themes that tie and have shaped my journey, my social justice journey. COVID really connected us in a way that I think the world was not ready for. So what has that looked like in the work that we do? There's a universal crisis, and most of it for children and young people. It will be incredibly difficult. The impact is lifelong, and it will be incredibly difficult to really emerge from this. There are 4 to 5 main dimensions I want to speak about. So when you're thinking about peace again, what does that mean for all of us that have been impacted, especially the most disadvantaged? COVID has pushed more households into multidimensional poverty. Approximately 150 million additional children are living in multidimensional poverty without access to essential services. That means things where we may take for granted: education, healthcare, housing, nutrition, sanitation, and water. And this survey comes from over 70 countries. And the data, the scientists found that 45% of children were severely deprived of at least one of these critical needs, even before the coronavirus hit. But this was further exacerbated with this pandemic. So we know 150 million more children don't have access to one or more of these things: education, healthcare, housing, nutrition, sanitation, and water. I think this was also spoken about with the last speaker also really took time to highlight this, especially in the context of what it means to be a Lasallian, thinking about learning, and COVID, as we know, has really exacerbated the learning crisis. 188 countries have imposed countrywide school closures. We've all experienced that, which has affected 1.6 billion children and young people. So what this means is that we're estimating potential losses that, of course, would occur with these closures, including the development of our human capital. And with more than 2/3 of countries have introduced, national distance learning platforms. But in low to middle income countries, like the ones I come from, that learning, the distance learning has only been extended to about 30% of the population. So that means 1/3 of the world's young people, 1/3 are excluded from already digitally excluded. So that means 1/3 of children and young people in this world are not learning since the COVID response. When we think about threats to child survival and health, 1.2 million children and over 56,000 mothers could die in 6 months due to disruption in basic interventions, because healthcare facilities or the healthcare system has been so overburdened with COVID cases and more. We're seeing that over 56,000 mothers could die in 6 months. So every stride that we've made to ensure that mothers and babies survive childbirth, all those gains have regressed. We think about more vulnerable children suffering from malnutrition. We know that as many as 132 million people may go hungry in 2020. And of that 36 million children will go hungry. And 370 million children may miss out nutritious food because they're not going to school. And lastly, this also means that we see a reduction in access to life-saving vaccines. So due to COVID, approximately 18 million children under the age of 1 in at least 68 countries may miss out on receiving life-saving vaccines that are needed in the first 1,000 days of their lives. So what does peace look like to you? It's beyond the sense of tranquility. It's beyond the sense of we cannot take for granted having family, having a roof over our heads, having our health, having access to distance learning, right? Or a remedial learning. It's beyond the fact every one of us sitting here today are the most incredibly privileged, lucky, blessed of all these numbers that I have just given. What does this look now for these 5 pillars around peace and security when we are failing a good portion of the population of the world's population? So in looking and thinking about these big numbers in our work, we're trying to scale up a lot of what we do. My work in the last couple of months has been looking at different ways in which we can harness technology to ensure that we are able to disseminate risk communication and messaging so that people are aware. But I know that regardless of what digital and social media platform I employ, the digital divide is real, and I cannot reach the most vulnerable because they don't have connectivity, or there's a literacy issue, or they're experiencing violence and unsafety in their homes. There's several reasons, and that makes me really, sometimes it's an overwhelming feeling. When we think about the next phase of this of COVID, yes, we're going into a second round of closures or lockdowns, but the reality is that we're also trying to prepare vaccine-ready communities. How do you convince communities that this vaccine versus, having access to basic necessities like food and water is a priority when people are just trying to survive? I'm going to wrap up because I see I have 4 minutes here. These are the questions that I'm grappling with. But as we sort of celebrate and take stock of peace, I think today has been really great in terms of providing a framework and a structure and a reminder and giving us tangible tools and thoughts and research to think about how we think about violence. When you see something, you say something. How women and girls are disproportionately, and non-binary people are disproportionately affected by it, and how COVID is exacerbating this injustice. We've also had conversations about how do we sort of take stock and think about our own personal inner peace and how that aligns with our values and who we are and what we think we can do and the agency that exists within us. I've tried in a very ad hoc way, because I'm a bit tired, to give you a bit of my own journey, what has really influenced my own heart space, and to serve in my community as a privileged Sierra Leonean, to ensure that my identity as Black and woman is part of broader social justice issues, whether it's Black Lives Matter, and talking about and unpacking and interrogating how we think about racism. Racism isn't just about, for me, the type of racism I really focus on is anti-Black racism. And it's not just about people of African descent, but it is anyone that presents as Black. If you're a dark Filipino, if you're a dark South Asian, if you're a dark Latina, if you're a dark or you're indigenous person, all of that has informed the work that I do today when we think about youth and children. And COVID, because it's such a global issue, forces my colleagues, forces all of us to not only come back and revisit our own sense of peace, our own sense of privilege, revisit the tools that we are able to have at our disposal, but to also seek knowledge, to understand a lot more, to redefine and re-ask and demand that peace be a universal reality for everyone. So, I hope these reflections can help you or can at least resonate in your journey. And I hope that you're picking up all your struggle, your privilege, your dreams, your aspirations, and you're using them as fuel to impact someone as close to you. It can be your friend, your community, your school, your church, whatever it is, we all have a role to play and we can play it. Because if you've ever experienced safety, if you've ever experienced security, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're also passing that feeling, that potential, that need to everyone around us. So thank you for having me, and looking forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fatuwari, for your very inspiring talk. Before we proceed to our next segment, let us first take a break as I introduce to you our performer for today. They are best known for their vibrant performances of our country's ethnic and traditional dances. They are the DLS Youth Folk Dance Group that seeks to connect the Lasallian youth to their Filipino heritage. Welcoming our very own LSTC Folk.
performance LSDC folk. With that, I guess we can now proceed with the program since I know this is what everyone is looking forward to.
That is absolutely right. So moving forward with the last portion of our live program, let us welcome back our speakers, Ms. Riza Torrado, Ms. Marianne Donahue Lynch, and Ms. Fatu Worry for a quick interview with questions sent by our delegates.
Hello, Ms. Riza, Ms. Mary Ann, and Ms. Fatu. How are you all?
Great.
Good. What a wonderful program you have put together. Congratulations to the planning committee and for everybody who's participating. What an honor to be with my fellow speakers. So inspiring. Thank you. Thank you.
How about you, Ms. Riza? How are you?
Feeling great thus far. I'm amazed with the kind of commitment that you have been devoting to these social issues. Wonderful for young people like you.
And Ms. Fatu, it's quite early for you to work. How are you?
I'm good. I'm awake now. No, but thank you. Just I only have gratitude for this space. So thank you.
We just have a few questions for you that were sent by our delegates through our Zoom chat. And we also have questions from our Facebook live stream viewers. So let's start with the first question. This question is for Ms. Riza. You mentioned that there are instances wherein people will not believe the woman or she is being victim blamed, which can lead to them not speaking up. How can we assure that these women will be heard?
That's a very wonderful question. Yes, how to ensure that they will be heard, of course, is that we should always be looking into a frame of victim-centered approaches. This has been being harped by the UN. That what the women says, it's their experience, and we must recognize that each experiences of gender-based violence is distinct to each individual, but there can be commonalities. And it's very important that we have the institutions that they can trust and that they can be accessed so that they can talk about their experiences. So, and let's encourage them by doing more advocacies, awareness raising, and empowering them to speak up for themselves.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you
Riza,
so
for
much, Ms.
answering
Riza.
that question. Red, let's go for the next question.
So we have a question for Miss Mary Ann here. So Miss Mary Ann, you touched a lot on religious subjects in your talk a while ago. So your question from our delegates is, what is your opinion on religious people who tend to discriminate the LGBTQ plus community?
So I'll give you two perspectives. I'm very proud that the District of Eastern North America 5 years ago issued a pastoral statement on LGBTQ rights, and that it's based on my personal held beliefs as well. And that is, we're all made in the image and likeness of God. And as being imagined into being by God, we are to all be treated not just equally, but with equity, where structures need to be challenged and changed, and laws as well. So the other dimension of that I think is important is that in church teaching in particular, there are various aspects of church teaching, right? There's dogma, and there is doctrine, and there is practice. And the current teaching on LGBTQ in regard to church doctrine is something that I believe, through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is something that can evolve over time. And I give I have great admiration for people who are courageous to speak up, to claim their space, to dialogue, to work with others, to bring about an understanding that we're all created in the image and likeness of God, and that we all deserve to be treated with respect.
That's right, Miss Mary Ann. That's very inspiring to know. Especially you mentioned a while ago about the Trinity icon, which should be followed by the Lasallians. Well, now for the following question. This is for Miss Fatu. When was the moment you realized that you want to be a humanitarian worker?
Um, there are many moments, but I think the most poignant one is I went to give a training in another town in my country, in the Eastern Province. It was to train traditional birth attendants on how to sort of integrate into the more formal system. We're trying to say that no woman should give birth at home. I had just returned back into my country after doing a lot more community mobilization and activism in Vancouver, in Canada. And so, like I said, I returned back home 21 years later, and I was trying to figure many things out: my identity, my connection to my country, and my purpose, and how I could serve in a meaningful, authentic, and respectful way, and recognize that I wasn't, like, I didn't have all the answers, and regardless of being a diaspora, that it is my people that and communities that really are the true agents of transformation. In that journey, I was working for the small NGO, and I was asked to train traditional birth attendants and work within the healthcare system to ensure that we reduce maternal mortality. So I went to the Eastern Province in my country, and I was going, when I entered the training center, it was actually a peripheral health unit. So it's a small clinic in the small town. And I am direction challenged, so I'm always getting lost. So I accidentally walked into the ward where a 16-year-old girl had just given birth. And her placenta was on the floor. She was sprawled open, and her newborn could not breathe. And they had all the wrong equipment, and they could not resuscitate this newborn child. And so I wasn't making a lot of money or anything, but to me it was absurd. So I was with the district nurse, and I said, well, can we call an ambulance? And she said, no, we really can't. I'm like, mother is young, she's scared, she's in this very cold, very unclean room. Her child, this newborn, is on a table and can't breathe, and you're telling me that we can't call an ambulance? And so she finally, after persuading her for like 10 minutes, she said, okay, I'll call. She called the ambulance in the next town, in the next big town, and the ambulance driver said he had lost his keys. We called again, and he said, oh, I don't have petrol. And so here we were just, it was just divine timing that we happened to be there, or really I happened to be there. And I'm not saying I'm a savior or anything. It was that moment. And so I took what I had. We found a taxi in this small town, put the 16-year-old mother, put her own mother in a taxi, and rushed them to the nearest town where they had the big hospital. So after I completed my training with traditional birth attendants who were like, well, thanks for the solar panel and this new phone. Sure, we'll stop delivering women in our houses. Who knew if that happened? But I was still so concerned and so disturbed that, our healthcare system was so weak that this is how so many women and babies die. So when I went back into the main town, I went to the hospital, and I still have a picture to this day where I saw the baby in an incubator. They had found, is in the hospital, and the mother had been cleaned, and she was just crying and in tears. And I held that baby, like just my finger touched that baby and just held that baby. And I thought to myself, A, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. B, this is literally what I'm meant to be doing. I'm meant to be working with communities, for communities, changing systems, influencing them, and doing my part to ensure that everyone has access to good healthcare. Everyone, the things that you're talking about, Marianne, which is around equity. Just equity, just access. The difference between her and me is that I can afford something and she can't. And that to me is so unjust. And that completely defined my entire career. And then I went on this journey, and here I am.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fatu. Maybe for the other speakers as well, you can share similar stories of what really motivates you to continue your passion and dedication to what you do. So maybe we can start with Miss Riza.
Thank you. That's a very Miss Universe like question. I'm pressured to give a very nice answer. But what motivated me to be in this gender equality work is the fact that reality-wise, I see this manifesting even in my own family um, uh, in the very institutions that I have worked with in the past. I've seen this inequality manifesting before my very eyes, though they are not very blatant, but you could feel it. And but I think the most defining moment that really made me commit into this work that I'm doing was when Typhoon Yolanda happened, or Typhoon Haiyan. And I was then working with the Department of Social Welfare and Development. Then we went to this to the area of Leyte, wherein I saw a lot of suffering mothers. I was a young mom, newly new mother by that time. So I saw that, hey, if we are just having a lot of women, just empower the women, make them have choices, make them have opportunities like the ones that I have. Maybe, just maybe, this could be an open door for the world to change a little bit. So that's my inspiration, seeing and immersing myself with these realities all over the Philippines.
Thank you, Miss Riza. What about you, Miss Marianne?
Well, thank you for the question. I think what inspires me is the engagement and involvement in education and the opportunity to be involved with that throughout the District of Eastern North America, but also globally through our Lasallian family. And education changes lives, right? It empowers, it inspires, it gives people encouragement to dream and to imagine. But I'd like to share one story with you that was a pivotal moment in my life in this Lasallian journey that's been over 25 years in the process. And I was visiting, it was in 2016, and I was visiting Mangaza College in Nakuru, Kenya. And I had a wonderful conversation with a group of young women and was invited to go to their homes and, saw where they lived in corrugated houses with, tin roofs, and studying by the light of a candle, and, but so inspired. And again, that hospitality, right? So we had that opportunity for hospitality and engagement. We went back to the college. We're sitting and having a conversation again. And I asked a question that I did not know would be life-changing for me. And the question was, what obstacles prevent you from fully accessing your Lasallian education here at the college? And they mentioned things such as affordability of tuition and transportation and food insecurities. And then this one woman whose house I had been to, she looks around at the group and she says, sometimes if it's a important class or the national exam, and I don't have access to personal hygiene items, I may go into town and, she didn't use this term, but engage in situational prostitution just to get enough money to buy personal hygiene items for her menstruation so she could attend class or sit for the national exam. Well, I sat there again as realizing in that moment the incredible position of privilege that I was in, because that never occurred to me as even being an issue of inequality and access, right? But that's my personal experience. Anyway, long story short, we had to continue the engagement in the conversation as I saw a couple of other young women nod their heads. And we left that conversation and went and had a conversation with the brother president of the school and another woman who works there in the office, Jane, who is like a mother to these young women. And we decided right then and there to immediately address that situation, but more importantly, to start to create the structures that empowers the young women to articulate the obstacles and to find ways to solve and those remove those obstacles from the path. And I turned to Jane and I said, "What do you want to call this?" And she said, "Lasallian Women of Hope." And from that point to now, it's gone through a process where it's now a project of solidarity and development out of Rome. It is connected through my region of North America and Francophone Canada to the current campaign by Solidarity and Development around the United Nations sustainability goals, goal number 4, equity and education. And what began as an encounter, a conversation, the vulnerability of this young woman to share her very personal experience has led to a transformative experience for other Lasallian women and girls around the world in our Lasallian family. So it's those kinds of moments, maybe not so grand, that we have daily in terms of encounter and conversation and challenge to open our hearts to envision what can be, that I want to remind all of us that we can continue our journey becoming engaged in those kinds of encounters that are life transforming.
Thank you so much, Miss Mary. And we have the privilege to give hope to these people. So it's never too late to start now. So this question is for Miss Riza. Women who experience violence have someone to fight for them. But how about men who are experiencing violence from women and other people? Who is going to be their voice? Considering they're taught to man up and stay quiet about being beaten. Miss Riza, please.
I think the main message that I am resonating since I presented the presentation is that we should speak up whenever we see different kinds of violence, whether that's committed against women, the other non-binary gender identities. We should also speak up. It's very important that if the man becomes now the victims of gender-based violence, don't keep quiet about it. Don't be shy about it, and it doesn't make you less of a man if you report this, or if you have, like what I said, where can they bring these concerns? First, they can discuss this among their peers, someone they could trust, or if it's too violent that this needs reporting, they should also be going to the police. Remove the stigma. It doesn't make you less of a man if you say you are being beaten. So if we truly speak about genuine equality, I think we should be fair in this one. If we have issues, if we know in the future that we have rising violence against men, then also this could be also a genuine issue that can be lobbied, of course, by men, because they are to be the ones who knows what's going on with this. So that's my main message. Speak up, find people you can trust, who can provide you the safe space, and if it's going too far, too violent, report also to authorities, and deconstruct the myth that men cannot be always strong at the time, and sometimes they do also experience violence.
Thank you so much, Ms. Riza, for that. I guess jumping off from speaking up, so the next move would be to actually have actions to alleviate these kind of problems. So we have a question for all three of you. How do you maintain your peace with the people around you and most especially within yourself? So maybe we can start with Miss Fatu.
How do I maintain the peace?
How do you maintain your peace with the people around?
That's a really loaded question. It's a beautiful question. For me, it's been a lifelong journey and it's going to continue being one. I'm constantly acquiring different tools and ways to just ground myself. Like I said, my definition, my personal definition of peace is just being able to surrender and acknowledge what I have no control over and recognize that I'm here. It's to ground myself in the moment, to really ground myself in my blessings, in my realities, and what I can control today. It is in being with my family and feeling safe and loved and nurtured and experiencing laughter. It is in silence, right? So based on my definition, I try to go to those places that feel safe to me, that bring joy, that reaffirm that I matter, that are spaces of healing. And when I can't, when the people that bring that to me or the things like music or whatever, the things that I would go to sort of nurture my peace, I have to get really still. I get still and I have to hear my voice. And that is super important for me. I think the takeaway for me in all of this, when you're talking about how do you ground yourself all the time, is to come back to the here and to the now and to remember my intentions, to remember what's important, that I still have breath. And as long as I have breath, I have opportunity. And if I have opportunity, well, the world's my oyster. So this is how I am maintaining peace right now. And it wasn't always like that. It's been a really rugged, complicated journey. And not all of us even know, how to bring ourselves back to what really matters, how to have that inner peace in a sea of noise. And there's a lot of noise where we are inundated every single day. So I guess my honest answer is that I'm still figuring it out. But for now, it's the practice of coming back to my center.
Thank you, Miss Fatu. What about you, Miss Marianne?
Well, thank you. The Quakers have a wonderful saying, the sister speaks my mind. And so, I agree. Much of it it's the journey. And in this present moment, in my present context, in my country, one of the things that maintains my peace is having those moments of silence. That icon that I showed of Trinity, just having the moments of silence as Lasallians, remembering that we're in the holy presence of God, entering into a space where I can be, where I can rest, but where I can also hear and perhaps be challenged as well. I think the other part of it where I find my peace is together and by association with other Lasallians and other like-minded people. Because my peace will be disturbed by both questions and attitudes that can be hostile, but also it can be disturbed for good reasons, like questions that could challenge me, that I have to have conversation, with other people about, and again, go to prayerful reflection for that. So, yeah, I would say I absolutely agree, though. It's a journey, it's a process. And if you ask me that question 48 hours from now or on November 4th, I could have a completely different answer.
Thank you, Miss Marianne. What about you, Miss Riza? Do you have any insights to share on how you maintain peace within yourself and the people around you? Miss Riza, if you can, please.
I think that's a very beautiful question and one of the toughest questions as of me thus far. But like my colleagues, I agree with some of the key points that they raised. Lately, I had some interest over Reiki healing, and I remember that symbol in there. It's the spiral, like the universe. from outward, the circle goes inward. So to me, peace is just like that. It's the journey towards the center of yourself. So, but there are three elements that I think I'll be holding on to that peace. One, of course, myself, my environment, the community around me, the people around me, and most importantly, the prime mover or the force, God, whatever you want to call that one. I think these three elements should be in our life to attain genuine peace with ourselves. Because reality is we are living in an ecosystem where we will be disillusioned, disappointed with the realities that we are seeing. For instance, our dreams being not realized in our timelines, the realities around our environment, so much sufferings, especially now that we have this pandemic, people experiencing a lot of mental breakdowns nowadays. So it's very important and it's essential that always at the end of the day, your life, you at different stages in your life, you will define peace, maybe perhaps differently. But what is essential is your journey towards yourself. At the end of the day, that's gonna be you. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Riza. Now, for all of you three, I have one other loaded question. So the final question you have to answer is, what does it mean to be a catalyst of peace? And if you can, just answer it in one sentence. So maybe we can start with you, Ms. Fatoon.
I'm starting again. What does it mean to be a catalyst of peace? Showing up. I show up. I want us to show up when it's hard, when we are unsure, when we're scared, when we don't know the how, but we know why. Just show up. Everything else will fall into place. And so that's what drives me, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What about you, Ms. Riza? What does it mean to be a catalyst of peace?
Mean to be a catalyst of peace. In few words, work for it because it doesn't come quick. And we need full of people approach.
Very well said, Ms. Riza. What about you, Ms. Marianne? What does it mean to be a catalyst of peace?
Well, it's interesting because, I've been given this a little bit of thought since I was asked to be on this panel. And we Lasallians love acronyms, right? So I was playing around with a few things and I came up with a spark. Pope Francis tells us we have the spark of the divine in each one of us. So we need to be spiritual and have space for silence. We need to be passionate in our prophetic actions. We need to advocate in association with one another. We need to be reflective and we need to be a kindle for others to be a spark with our Lasallian zeal. So I didn't know you were going to ask that question, but there's my acronym, SPARK.
Thank you very much, Miss Marianne. I love that, spark. Being the spark to start the fire of starting the peace, right? So thank you so much to our speakers and of course to our delegates and live stream viewers as well for that very insightful discussion.
Of course, this event would not have been possible without our generous partner organizations, namely the Lasallian, Archers Network, BLB Live, LSDC Folk, LSDC Street, Inner Soul, Council of Student Organizations, the LaSalle Philippines, and International Council of Young Lasallians.
As we end our live stream and proceed to our closed-door session for our delegates on this call, I would like to call on our project heads for this event, Kyla Ariola, Julian Rising, and Eliza Reducindo for their closing remarks.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I am Kyla Ariola.
I'm Julian Rising.
And I am Eliza Reducindo, and we are your project heads for ILDP 2020, Choosing to be Catalysts of Peace.
Truthfully, these past couple of months have been quite the journey. The sleepless nights, the late night meetings, the endless work that had to be done in just a short amount of time, all leads up to these 2 days. This conference is an event that we have never done before, and the fact that we are able to plan something this big in a span of 3 months and during a pandemic is a huge honor for the three of us.
When we started planning for International Lasallian Day for Peace, our initial project was actually a simple webinar exclusively for our university in the Philippines. From then on, our ideas and purpose for this event just kept on getting bigger. And to tell you the truth, there were times that we were overwhelmed with everything we had to do. Looking back at our journey for ILDP 2020, we can truly say that we are so glad we took a giant leap and made this event international. It humbles us to meet different Lasallians all around the world, striving for a more peaceful community. It is truly times like these that we are thankful for technology because it gave us the opportunity to unite us as one Lasallian community.
Knowing that these Lasallians from all around the world are with us right now, eager to learn how we can achieve peace during these unprecedented times, gives us a sense of fulfillment in our hearts. Of course, we wouldn't have done it without the people who have been with us throughout the whole journey.
We would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who made this event possible. Thank you to our speakers, Ms. Riza Torrado, Ms. Marianne Donahue Lynch, Ms. Fatou Wuri, Professor Shabazz Khan, and Brother Armin Luistro, FSC, for giving us the opportunity to learn from your experiences and for the knowledge that you have shared on how to attain and spread peace. Thank you to our hosts, Ret Chu and Sofia Beltrano, our facilitators, and our ambassadors for saying yes to us. Thank you to our translators for keeping the connection within the international delegates and speakers throughout the event. Thank you to our partner organizations, Office of Young Lasallians, De La Salle Philippines, and Council of Student Organizations. To our media partners, the Lasallian and Archers Network, and to our performers, LSDC Folk, LSDC Street, and DLSU Inner Soul. Honestly, without you and your organizations, this conference would not have been this grand and smooth flowing.
Second of all, thank you to Brendan Bersena for being our technical director. This live stream wouldn't be happening right now without you. Thank you to Abby Rania, our documentation chairperson, Megan Cabazor and Dan Anastasio for making our publicity materials. Thank you to Ms. Lunel, Sir Topher, S-Life, and most especially to Sir Keen Palatino for supporting us and being hands-on with us throughout the whole planning process, and also for being our main source of help when it comes to international and even national connections. Last but not the least, thank you to our Vice President for Internal Affairs, Jolson Cruz, and of course to our Chairperson, Ray Nivales, for trusting us with this project and for being the best mentor and guide throughout the whole journey of the creation of this event. Your very systematic, disciplined, and responsible attributes inspired us to give out our very best for this event. We would also like to thank the rest of the university student government for your continuous support.
Lastly, thank you to our delegates. There is no doubt that all of you can conquer and share your peace in your own little ways. We are so glad that we have the opportunity to celebrate International Lasallian Days for Peace in a very unique way this year. As we conclude, we realize that we now live in a time where uncertainty, chaos, and fear may be inevitable. Yet, we must believe that choosing peace is still possible. It is still possible for peace to be our response to violence, poverty, inequality, and other emerging societal issues. We hope that this conference inspired all of you to choose peace, despite the difficult events we are faced with every day. Once again, we thank you for being a part of this year's celebration of ILDP 2020. May this online conference serve as a reminder that we, as one Lasallian community, can choose to make our world a better and safer place for all. We hope that you have been inspired to become catalysts of peace. Once again, thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you, Kyla, Julian, and Eliza. Truly, this event wouldn't have been made possible without you three. So I believe that was a good mark to end the first day of this event on. So that's all for today, folks. Thank you to everyone who joined us on our live stream, and of course, to our delegates here on this Zoom call.
We hope that you enjoyed these insightful discussions about our three pillars and have been inspired by our speakers to become catalysts of peace. We will now be proceeding to our closed-door session for this conference, so delegates, please stay on call, and to our live stream viewers, thank you for joining us today. Once again, I am Sofia Beltrano.
And I am Red Chu, and we are your hosts for today's International Lasallian Days of Peace 2020, choosing to be catalysts of peace. Thank you, and Animo Lasal.
Delegates, we would like to invite you all to open your cameras to be featured on the live stream as our Technical Director, Brendan Barcena, cues you all in.